Hi, welcome to the Indie Wine Podcast. My name is Matt Wood, and this is episode 37. I recently spoke with Chris Brockway of Broc Cellars in Berkeley. Chris has been making natural wine for over 20 years, starting Broc with a single barrel in 2002 and continuing to grow since then while working with a large variety of grapes and regions. In 2023, they purchased Fox Hill Vineyard after 10 years of working together and have now taken over the farming. We discuss how Chris got started, the natural wine scene at the time, some of his more iconic Broc wines, his collaborations, and purchasing a farm, not just a vineyard. Here we go.
It has that West Berkeley architecture where you kind of have like those glass tiles that are kind of concrete kind of poured around it, and then you kind of raise the wall up.
Oh, is that how they do it?
I think is how they do it.
Okay.
But, if you drive around West Berkeley, you'll see a lot of those buildings. A lot of those glass tiles are like cracked because, like minor earthquakes and things like that.
Yeah,
shatter.
Just settling and, so close to the bay over here.
Yeah,
it's got to be kind of a little bit of water under.
Saturated, sandy ground underneath. So, but that was a cool building.
So I guess, I wanted to hear a little bit about your background. I know you're born in Nebraska, right?
Born in Iowa, raised in Nebraska.
Oh, okay.
So, when I go visit, either of those states, right? If you're out selling wine and stuff like that, when I'm in Iowa, it's like I'm born in Iowa. When I'm in Nebraska, it's like raised in Nebraska. You can kind of work it that way, But it was, born and raised in the Midwest, basically.
Yeah. Was wine part of your upbringing at all?
When my mother remarried, my stepfather had a very small cellar, but he had, a European wine cellar, mostly French. And that was my first exposure to wine, right? You kind of like, it always seemed like we lived in Omaha, but we lived outside Omaha. So it always seemed like I had a lot of free time because there wasn't a lot around me.
Okay.
So, you kind of go in, you check out, small family, Burgundy or whatever. There's nothing expensive or collectible. It was drinking wines.
Yeah.
Right? But there's a local, wine and cheese shop in late 70s, early 80s, Omaha that had like some of these, probably most of the wineries aren't around anymore or whatever. So that was kind of like, it's kind of like your football cards. You're collecting like wine labels and, we actually like peel them off and soak them in water.
Okay. Yeah. You have the little binder.
Your shoebox.
Okay.
So, that was kind of like, not interested in wine, but kind of like, what is this, wine places, someplace foreign kind of exposure, right?
Yeah.
So, and it was on the table, but like I said, it wasn't collectible stuff. It was wine with a meal.
Yeah.
Kind of thing.
That's the best way.
Yeah. So that was, like my first exposure, and like a lot of people, you try it a little bit, kind of, as we do with our kids.
Yeah. Nice. At some point you made your way out to California. Was that to pursue wine or?
Yeah. It was one of those things where, I was going to college, I moved around quite a bit when I was younger, through like high school, especially, kind of a lot of, different English Commonwealth countries, I guess.
Okay.
But I came back to Nebraska for college and studied, I went to college to learn, so I studied philosophy.
Okay.
Right. Yeah. I was like, it's what I wanted to do. And I was like, well, this is what I want to study. It's my life and get good grades.
Yeah.
Got to have something you're interested in. But then you're like, well, what am I going to do?
Right. It's kind of a teaching.
What happens then, once you're kind of like, a year or two away from graduating, you're like, okay, where's this going to go? And, but by that time, I was pretty interested in wine, right? Working in restaurants and, drinking that small amount of wine that's left of the customer left in their bottle, and, even if it's a few drops, just to try to taste things.
Yeah,
and,
getting to try lots of different wines and
Yeah.
some stuff that's probably kind of out of your budget otherwise.
Yeah, even back then, you'd see what you can afford, while you're going to school, waiting tables, and what money is left outside of work and what you're trying in the bus station kind of thing. And so I was into it, I was talking about it, and this happened a few times in my life where somebody's like, you talk about wine so much. I don't know if they meant this as a positive always.
Okay.
Yeah, why don't you become a winemaker? And I was like, well, that's the stupidest thing. And we're in Nebraska, and I don't know anything about winemaking, or, it's like that's, basically misinformed as a youngster, right? How things work. And then, finally it kind of sunk in. It's like, well, maybe I can make wine, right? Maybe. And I kept talking about it so much, I almost left myself no choice but to move out to California to make.
Okay.
It was almost a way to will my, self out there, and, not people. It's like, hey, I thought you were going to make wine. You're still here in Nebraska, kind of thing. So
yeah, it's kind of inevitable after a certain point.
Yeah. You have to do it, or else everybody's just going to think you're, full of it, so to speak. So so moved out to California after college, after a few detours, and kind of wanted to be a California winemaker. Kind of could afford Zinfandel and things like that on a tight budget, and so kind of got interested in that way and started reading about the history of California wine and stuff before he moved out. And just packed up the car. Drove to UC Davis, knocked on the counselor's door. I was like, I'm here for school. And she's like, you have to apply.
Okay.
Oops. I'm like, well, I'm here, right? Kind of thing. It's a story I've told a bunch of times, but I kind of remember. It's like, it's just like, you kind of just get the gumption, and it's just like, all right, I'm going to go and not think about it too much.
Yeah.
But I probably could have thought about it a little bit more. But, it was fine. I drove out to Davis, kind of did like concurrent enrollment and studied kind of some of the basics, in not only winemaking, but also with the philosophy background, didn't have a lot of the science either. So kind of started taking some of the basic chemistry and stuff like that. So that's kind of what the start happened. But that was a long time ago. That was like in the late 90s.
Late 90s. Okay. Then you switched to Fresno at some point,
switched to
right?
Fresno. My counselor at Davis is like, you're doing what? Usually you start at Fresno, and if you want to transfer, you transfer. But, I liked being in Fresno. You're kind of like trapped in this area with a bunch of, or not a lot, a few students, like 20 students, and you're all there for the same reason and kind of the spot. So it was kind of cool. You kind of like focus on wine and winemaking and studying and all that. So it was a good experience. But I think you're also leaving at some point.
Yeah, you're not necessarily there for forever.
Yeah, you could be from there and in the school and want to stay in the area, but usually if you're coming from someplace else, you're going to be moving on once you get your degree or whatever it is. So,
is there anything that jumps out to you that you really take away from that experience, or that you think back on a lot?
How little I knew.
Okay.
About not just some of the science. I always remembered like the hardest, like it's important. It how yeast work and bacteria and so that was a great experience. Sure. But how difficult it was transitioning from like studying like philosophy to the hardest chemistry class was the first one.
Okay.
Right, because you got to retrain your brain, and then once you get your footing going, but then also just the getting comfortable being in, I wanted to be in a winery at that time. I wanted to be in a cellar, and I had never worked in a cellar, but I figured I should get like this science background and there's a lot of ways to go about doing anything. I don't think there's a perfect path. It's what you feel like you need as a person. And, but yeah, just how little I knew about science and how little I knew about getting around in a wine cellar where, kind of the biggest, you probably would absorb more if you knew more, from that experience. But, it's kind of just starting from, just kind of remember it's like, oh yeah, starting from square one kind of thing.
Yeah.
So, but it was a cool experience, right? It's it was a lot to sink in. One thing I do wish is like, my interest was at the time was so focused on making wine that I don't know if I learned as much about viticulture.
Okay.
For a few reasons, just I really wanted to understand winemaking. I didn't have a big focus on that. But then I was also at a school, viticulture was, entwined with growing grapes for wine, but also table grapes and raisins. Yeah. Okay. So you kind of, and that kind of, I think, pulled you away from, you're like, well, I'm here for wine. It's all interesting, right? But it wasn't what you were specifically there for. So I think, I could have understood things a little bit better had I been a little bit older.
Okay.
Right? So, but, we're making up for that now.
Yeah. Yeah. In a great way. You've worked for JC as well as Rosenblum in the past, right?
Right. That was my first introduction professionally.
Yeah.
Is a winery. Rosenblum was a winery over in Alameda. And this was, coming out of school at a time where, we were kind of talking about it this morning as we're getting ready to bottle. We've been doing this long enough that we've seen some of the kind of the ups and downs of the wine industry, right? There's always this ebb and flow and this correction, and we maybe are going through a little correction right now. But I remember kind of like, 98 to 2002, there wasn't, maybe a lot of jobs out there, kind of not quite philosophy degree coming out of school, but, still winemaking. Where do you travel around and work some, which is a great option. But I was offered a job coming out of school, and it was here in Alameda for the winemaker at Rosenblum. So, I kind of jumped at it, because you're in debt.
Yeah.
Yeah. Not heavy in debt, but still in debt. And so that kind of brought me up to the Bay Area, and it was cool because, you have all these, like a lot of old vine grapes, a lot of historical vineyards from all over California. So for me, being from Nebraska, this was like pretty cool, right? It's like it's a good learning experience, and you're seeing all these different vineyards, all these different varieties from the state that you're kind of enamored with. Not just wine, just California as a whole. It is an amazing place, and so it was a pretty cool experience working for that and all these different. You got to know the wine growing throughout the whole state of California.
Yeah, and Kent worked with some pretty old vineyards also. It seems like he kind of had his hands in a lot of
a lot of Contra Costa
vineyards. Yeah.
Some that are still there and some that are gone.
Sure.
Right. It's like it's probably like a strip mall or a housing development named after what was planted there.
Yeah.
Originally 100 years ago. Right. So, but there was a lot of that, but it was a lot of Contra Costa, but a lot of, Santa Barbara up to Mendocino.
I think that when I learned that you kind of got your start there, it struck me as, I don't know if funny is the right word, but it's a very different style of wine than you make.
Right.
Where it was like very full throttle, a lot of like 16.3% Zins.
Give or take a percent. Yeah. And, Yeah, stylistically, it was, it was the opposite. So when, like when you're starting, you're like, oh, this is amazing, right? You got like all these grapes and all this, things coming in from left and right, and you're having these wines. But after a certain period of time, then all of a sudden it's like very high scoring wines too, because that was back in the day when that was driving, like Spectator, Parker, all that stuff.
Yeah.
But then it doesn't happen at once, but I think you'll hear like some person kind of plant the seed, like, I have a hard time drinking these wines. I was like, what do you mean? This is amazing. I drove out from Nebraska and, here I am. But then all of a sudden it hits you. It's like, palate fatigue or heaviness. And then, I remember because right away I started just making a little bit of my own wine. I was lucky enough to have a chance to do that. And then I just remember, we worked 3 different varieties, 3 different vineyards or something like that, just small amounts. And I was like, man, I'm having the hardest time putting like these blends together or just, getting ready for bottling. And then it seems obvious now, but it's like, oh, wait a minute, I don't like this. I don't like this style. It's like, why can't I get this? And then, then all of a sudden you realize it's like, oh, this isn't for me necessarily. And I'm not saying this to knock or judge or whatever, but, you realize, oh, this isn't, what you're told or what things are supposed to be is maybe not what you are. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it took a couple, once the novelty of everything, you're just like, oh, this is too heavy. This doesn't go with anything that we eat around here or whatever it is, whatever you want. And there was also, it wasn't just Rosenblum. That was like an industry as a whole. Right.
Yeah. It was a time of very big, overpowering wines.
It was a race.
Wines.
Right. Yeah. Who can make the highest alcohol, darkest. Now, I'm not saying this to be flip. There was like, like a push, right? It's like my wine is darker than yours. My wine's bigger than yours, kind of like that, that flexing and I was like, man, this isn't, this is not why I drove out here. This is not what I read in the history books. There's no, these aren't table wines, or wines that are meant to be with food or, that it was a stylistic approach that dominated the California wine industry at the time. And, I'm like, well, if I can't make something that I like and also just competing with everybody trying to, make wines into the same metaphysical box, right?
Yeah.
Then I might as well go broke or go out of business doing my own thing and making something that I like, and so, it took a few years for that to happen, but then, finally just like, all right, I got to get back to whatever that idea was that I had in my head that drove me out here in the first place.
Yeah.
And that's kind of how it started. And it's not a negative experience. It's a learning experience, right? So you can't really, but the only thing is that it does take you longer if you're starting back from zero, right? And you have to kind of relearn, as opposed to having a guide that is in line with where you want to go. That's the only thing. It takes more time, and because you have to learn from your own mistakes, and the only way to do that is to go through the process. And as opposed to learning something, then you can kind of use somebody else's knowledge to go by, as opposed to having to, kind of create your own knowledge, right?
Yeah, somebody else's kind of kickstart your journey a little bit. And there really weren't a whole lot of wineries in California. Like you said, it was a time of big wines. So I guess the opposite of that is that there's not a whole lot of wineries at that time making restrained
Right.
higher acid wines. It wasn't the in vogue.
Yeah. I mean,
at
they're
at
out
the
there.
time.
Those, it's like we're not doing anything new, right? We're doing stuff that was old, right? And so there's always a few places out there that are keeping kind of the non late 80s 90s mentality, right? They're going back to the 70s and how things were made a little bit then in a sense, or even beyond that. But there wasn't necessarily a lot of peers, directly around you.
Yeah.
You'd have to go find it and figure that out.
Was there a California wine at the time that helped to trigger your change from those bigger wines?
I don't know if it was. I'd have to think about that one. I don't think there's like a wine that kind of represented. It was more the idea of kind of what you read about historically. That kind of when you read about some of these, even like Napa Valley, like some of these 12% alcohol cabs and
sure
but it was also just trying to figure out a taste. I always go back to kind of where we live and not being like upset, but just noticing, kind of like in the Bay Area, like the wines that are served, at restaurants that you respect. And the wine shops, like there's Kermit Lynch down the road or whatever example you kind of want to throw out there. And, kind of like, like I said, there's a lot of people doing the same thing. And it's like, well, why can't we be more like how people eat here and make wine that kind of serves that function? And, why can't a local wine be on that list as well? And I think that was kind of like a big impetus, but there was a lot to unlearn.
Okay.
Right.
Yeah.
It's like, I remember there was like we were working with a organic vineyard down in Westside Paso Robles. So it's a little ways away, right? It's like 3 hours away, and we get down there whenever we could. And, it's like, we're picking, and I was like, I'm up here. I can't make it down there tomorrow, like in the morning, or to call the pick. So let's just do it. And I'll drive down and be there, like at 9 a.m., 10 a.m. And you get down there, it's like, oh shit, this is too early. It's like, it's like, oh man, we really jumped the gun on this Syrah. It's not how I was taught that it's supposed to be. And then you're just like upset and kicking yourself for not, being on the ball a little bit more. And you bring it up and you're like, all right, well, we'll ferment it and make it and see what we can do. And you're like, hey, wait, this tastes pretty good. It's like, it's like, pick a little bit earlier. This is like full of life and energy. And then all of a sudden it all starts to kind of click together. Right. And everything that we're talking about and discussing, it starts to kind of come together. It's like, all right, well, what if we kind of do this with everything, this mistake we made and just make everything a mistake.
Yeah.
In some people's eyes, right?
Yeah.
But, it's about, not waiting for things to kind of desiccate and dehydrate, and but catch them while they're full of life and nutrients and acidity and, and maybe just a little less acid or sugar, sorry.
Yeah.
And so, that's kind of breaking out of your comfort zone and start heading down that road.
Yeah, the Vine Stars Inn was kind of one of your early ones also, right?
Yeah. That was definitely one of the early ones, but that was kind of, a lot of that was like the vineyard telling you what it wanted to be, not just it wasn't so much the grape and the, kind of what I had in my head of what I think it should be. That was seeing other people make it what they thought it was supposed to be, but the vineyard telling you otherwise. So, it's like this the core of the Vine Star Zen was this, pretty cool vineyard up in Sonoma Valley that's like 50-degree slope, just volcanic rock, basically no soil, it's just the vines are just working their way through fissures in the rock on this mountainside. And there's like a lot of like potassium in the soil.
Okay.
So like if you get it riper, your pH starts to kind of get a little high, and it's like, I was like, oh, well, this is perfect for me. We can pick it like at low bricks, and it still has acidity, and it has all this nice balanced fruit, right? Everything's, kind of in line with each other, not in these parts. And so that was kind of how that, is this vineyard coinciding with like the history books of what I read about old school Zens, and everything kind of all played together. And then we kind of, thanks to another winemaker, Ed Kurtzman, put us in touch with another vineyard up the road in what is now called Fountain Grove, AVA, kind of a Buck Hill vineyard. And, that we picked maybe a little too early, but then it kind of blended nice to with this Arrowhead. And that's, kind of a happy accident, happy discovery that, kind of happened early on in our, kind of once I went out on my own. You kind of like stumble into like this cool, unique blend.
Yeah.
That's supposed to be kind of like Sonoma as a county, old school Zinfandel. But yeah, that's like a really good example, and that would have been like the 2009 vintage of the Vine Star Zen.
Okay. What was drawing you to vineyards at the time? What made you want to work with some of those vineyards?
Oh, I think it was
branch
anybody
out to some other grapes.
Anybody would sell me fruit, basically, right?
Yeah.
So, you had an idea of something you want to make. I was always interested in like old vine California unusual varieties, kind of like the underdog stuff, right? So Carignan, Valdegui, Grenache, a lot of these things, even like Chenin Blanc a little bit later. So that was always my interest, but, it's not always what presented itself. But, it was, a unique site, with somebody that you hopefully like working with because it's a relationship. But a lot of it was just kind of starting out and having nobody know who you are.
Okay.
Right. And somebody willing to, kind of take a chance and sell you a little bit of fruit to, this little warehouse in Berkeley kind of thing. Right. Kind of like, who are you? And, not everything worked out, especially when you don't own your own vineyard, you're kind of at the whim of other people. Some of these places get bought up. Right.
Sure.
They're like, beat it. We got it. Thanks, but no thanks. You're like, but I've been working on this, for 3 years, but that's just the way it goes, right? But a lot of it was just, relying on a lot of friends too, right? To kind of help steer you along and make a connection for you.
I imagine that's how you kind of ended up working with the Solano County vineyards and some of the old vines.
That was through a friend as well that kind of put me in touch with a grower. Steve Worth was one of the first places, but also a little bit of proximity, right? Trying to get stuff closer to home and closer to where you are. It's like, all right, we're making wine now, but it'd really be nice to interact a little bit more with the vineyard, have something a little bit closer, and I know all this sounds obvious, but when you're starting out, you're kind of trying to make things happen, right? And so it was nice. So a friend introduced us to Solano County. It's like 30 minutes away from our winery in Berkeley. Some old vine Valdegui, or called it Gamay, right? Some old vine Zinfandel, and we took over the whole vineyard, a few years later. But then there's a neighbor that has some old vine stuff too, and then there's a neighbor to that neighbor that has some, because a lot of people like to talk about old vine, but not everybody really cared that much about it, or as this is a time period where a lot of things were getting ripped out, replanted, and you're kind of like, well, I'll work with it. You don't need to tear it out and replant it. You got a buyer right here, kind of thing.
Yeah,
So,
and a little bit kind of under the radar region, also probably not getting maybe the attention that it
it's like a
deserves.
3-mile long or 2-mile wide or whatever, like Green Valley is in Solano County. So it just literally gets bypassed, above and below. But it, like a cool, little maritime influence.
Yeah.
A lot of afternoon winds come through, and just a unique little spot. But it was nice because it's like not at your front door, but pretty darn close in Berkeley terms.
Yeah.
So that was kind of, I think that was 2011. I think was kind of the first vintage with some Valdegi, some 1949, 1950 planting of Valdegi.
Nice.
Yeah.
What made you want to base the winery in Berkeley, have an urban winery? How did that sort of come about, as opposed to were you tempted to try to go to Sonoma or somewhere else? Or
well, I didn't know anybody there, so this is where I am. And I remember when I was over at the Rosenblum facility, just kind of moved up here, and living in Alameda before I moved over to San Francisco, driving by the old Camellia space here in Berkeley. And I think it was Tom Leaf that was the current winemaker there.
Okay.
And I was like, man, that would be a cool spot to make, have your own little place, do your own thing. And I always remembered that. I didn't know in 2008 we'd be moving into that space, or, that I'd be on my own, making my own wine. But it's kind of, you start here so you're comfortable, and you kind of know how to make things work, and so it's kind of what people are like, well, why are you down in Berkeley? Why aren't you up in wine country where everybody else is? And after a while, you're like, well, this is where all the people that buy my wines are. It's it started out with probably a mile radius from my apartment in San Francisco, kind of like Tenderloin, Nob Hills, where I sold my wines, right?
Yeah,
There's a few restaurants and a few wine shops, and that was my distribution network, right? And I commute over the Bay Bridge and make my wine, bottle it, and then stack it up in the hallway of my apartment, or in the cellar, or over at the winery, wherever we can fit stuff. And things just kind of blossomed, from there. But it's basically, that's what I knew, and that's what I knew in the sense of how to make things work. Just like basics, like logistics and things, right? I didn't know spaces in Sonoma or Napa or wherever, and I probably couldn't afford them.
Right, and you work with a pretty wide range of regions, so I guess it's probably a little centrally located to some of the
you can head north, you can head south, wherever you're working with. So you're not too far away from anything. So that part was kind of nice. And but it might be far from a vineyard, but it's close to where you live, and it worked out. So it would be hard for me to move up to Sonoma, for example, but still source fruit from Paso Robles, and that's not where we were at the time, as far as we weren't ready to commit to one place, because we still had that branching out just from, friends and friends of friends, to kind of work with. So
how did you find yourself working with Fox Hill Vineyard?
That was specifically because of Sam Bilbrough at Idlewild Wines. So Sam's father had worked with Lowell, who owned Fox Hill, Lowell Stone and his wife Barbara. Sam's father, I think, I'm not sure how far back, but worked quite a bit with Lowell. He was friends with Lowell, and he had his own label called Marietta, which is kind of, a California winery that's been around for a while, and people knew. And so Sam kind of grew up on that property, and once Lowell's health started to kind of fail a little bit, he needed help with that vineyard. It's about 56 acres planted. The total property is like 130 acres.
Okay.
And so, Sam kind of started becoming like the steward of the property almost as like a favor, because a friend of his dad, right? Not really for any kind of monetary, compensation, so to speak. And Sam started doing that, I believe, in 2009. And I think there was a lot of other wineries that were sourcing out of there from Lowell's connections. And but I think Sam reached out in like the beginning of 2013 to like a few of us that were kind of, in that realm. I think Hardy Wallace from Dirty and Rowdy, met us there that day. And I'm trying to remember who else I'm blanking, but Sam kind of drove us around, and it's like, hey, we have this available, we got this available, there's some Montepulciano, or there's some Nero d'Avola, maybe some Barbera, things like that. And I'm like, well, this is cool. I'll take the Nero. I love Sicilian grapes, and I was working at a wine shop in San Francisco once a week, Terroir, where we always, enjoyed Acapinti and Kos and things like that. So that's why I was kind of, I love Frappato, but there was some Nero right there, so there wasn't any Frappato, and so that's kind of how we started working with Fox Hill Vineyard, was thanks to Sam and kind of that tour that day with a few of us. And so that was our first vintage, 2013 Nero d'Avola.
Which I tasted that last weekend, 2 weeks ago. It was great. I mean, still drinking really well.
Yeah, I think as I was explaining, as we were pouring it for our Fox Hill event, it was a good vintage. I don't know if it was my best vintage, because it was the first time working with Fox Hill and first time working with Nero, but it was a good year. So it was just kind of make the wine and see what it has to say, and then from there, maybe you hopefully make some decisions to kind of dial it in, because I remember that first vintage of Nero, it tasted good, but, kind of like the acid was over here and the fruit was over there. And it's kind of like, the tannins, how do you make everything kind of come together? It had all these like components, but, that's kind of a part of, tasting terroir, and a grape from that place is like, how do you make a cohesive wine out of it? And so that was like just the learning, and we've had probably made some mistakes, but hopefully made better wine, maybe even from lesser vintages as we've moved along. But I was pretty happy to open it, so that was like an excuse because I think we have like one case, right? So we open that up and see. Let's see what's going on in front of everybody.
Put it out there.
Right. That's the thing with winemaking here. Yeah. You put it on the table and put it into people's glass, and and then people can think what they want, but you're kind of putting it out there, right?
Sure.
That's the thing with winemaking. Not everybody's gonna. Hopefully, people enjoy it, and but you're kind of putting yourself out there a little bit.
Yeah,
too,
definitely.
Right?
So after that first vintage, did you just kind of slowly expand your relationship with the vineyard there, getting
as things kind of came online. I can't remember how many varieties were planted at that time in the vineyard, but it was still quite a bit, because when Lowell took over the property, it was planted to Chardonnay, Johannesburg Riesling.
Okay.
And we're talking inland Mendocino, right? So
Yeah.
it's like this is a warm spot. You know,
Mm-hmm.
it's not Chardonnay and Riesling country.
Right.
So like in the late 80s and early 90s, you know, Lowell kind of tore out a lot of these things. He was into Italian wines and loved traveling to Italy and started planting, you know, kind of your basic varieties, right? Your for Italy, Nebbiolo, Sangiovese, Barbera, Dolcetto, all these
Mm-hmm.
things. Some Negro Amaro, Tokai Friulano. You know, most of these aren't obscure to us now, but at this period of time in California, it's like, you know, probably like you're planning what, you know,
Yeah.
kind of, and also a couple Portuguese varieties like Touriga Nacional and Sazao and all these things were pretty unusual, right?
Mm-hmm.
But that's what he wanted to do. Now, I don't know if a lot of these were suitcase clones, some of them were, and
Okay.
that he propagated himself, and you know probably some of it he was able to find within California. But that's kind of how it all started. And when we started working with Fox Hill, there was maybe like 14 other wineries, give or take
Okay.
one or two, that were working with the property, and maybe all of them didn't care how things were farmed, you
Okay.
know, or
Yeah.
they probably just wanted ripe fruit at a cheap price,
Mm-hmm.
right? And
Just kind of show up and get
yeah,
it.
yeah, kind of show up and get it, and you know, pay your $1,500 a ton or whatever. And you know, once we, you know, Sam and Evan Lewandowski, you know, they were kind of
Mm-hmm.
the first ones in there to kind of start making some changes,
Okay.
right? And
Yeah.
I think part of those changes was you know, not aligning with maybe a few people that were sourcing out of there. And part of the reason why we were invited to come check out the property is, you know, you start with like a few blocks here, and it's like, all right, we're doing these organic, and you know, other people are like, well, we don't care if it's organic, you know,
Yeah.
you know, it's like, well, this isn't lining up, right? Because the vineyard's
Sure.
going this direction now, right?
Yeah.
And you know, at first it started with parts of it, you know, where we're sourcing our fruit, to now there's like six of us that are sourcing in the whole vineyard. As of this year, it's now, you know, been a long time coming, but it's certified organic as of a couple months ago.
That's awesome. That's
Yeah.
a big step. Even just the certification. I mean,
Yeah, yeah.
that's-
I mean, just even getting it organic the whole thing took a while, and you know, there was, you know, obviously some people that were upset.
Mhm.
You know,
Yeah.
but you know, it makes you really appreciate the steps taken and the amount of work taking and the amount of changes that had to happen. So you know, the vineyard as a whole has been about 6 years now,
Okay.
farm organically, but just certified this year. But a lot of that's from the work that you know, Sam and Evan started, you know, back in 2009, I believe it was. So it's really great that we have like a lot of, you know, Lowell's original plantings out there. There's some new plantings as well, but you know, the core of the vineyard's all like those original plantings that
Okay.
Lowell put in. You know, and then there's a smattering of 1 acre of this and 1 acre of that Sam has put in, Evan's put in, and now that I've put in as well. So it's kind of, we figure out what, you know, we had this big tasting a couple of weeks ago with all six of us pouring our wines, and part of the point is it's like, okay, well, what is this place? You know, what does it have to say, and what does it want to do? And you know, that was just another step in like this evolution of this place, and not just Fox Hill, but also California, right?
Yeah.
You know, it's like, what does well here? It's still, you know, there's still a lot of questions to be asked, and a lot of answers, you know, that we're all looking for. So
Yeah. Are you continuing to expand the plantings up there and experiment with
Not
different things?
not too much, because we've kind of, it like I said, the last 10 years or so, a lot of work has gone into it, and I think there's now 25 different Italian varieties, 2 Portuguese, and 1 Spanish. There might be a few things that go in, but I think we're pretty set here. We don't want it to become a nursery. We want it to be a vineyard, right?
Yeah.
But you have to remember, we're surrounded by vineyards that are just like cab.
Sure.
100% cab, or there's you go a little farther north and you get into some more of the old school, the plantings, like the Zinfandels and Valdegis and stuff like that. Those are Carignan, those are still around, but a lot of these newer plantings are just one grape, and that's not very exciting. So we're going to try to build off of what's there and see where that goes. But we did try. It's funny. I've been doing this a long time, right? It's been over 20 years, and but as far as having a property that you're now responsible for from beginning to end, it's amazing how many mistakes you can make in the decision-making process, because this is all new. And sometimes mistakes just happen and they're out of your control. Like, we love the Nero d'Avola. That's what brought us there.
Yeah.
That's why we're there. And it's like, well, all right, maybe it's time we plant a little bit of Frappato, right?
Okay.
The Nero does well, we'll plant a little Frappato. So the cuttings arrive, they got the tag on it. It says Frappato. We had some of the Negro Amaro was struggling with just beautiful head trading vines, but that did great, very lush. But once you get close to harvest, they kind of, they're a little diseased, right?
Okay.
So they just kind of peter out around 17 bricks and kind of struggle from there. So it's like, well, the ones that are really struggling, let's graft over a little Frappato. And we're sitting there, it's harvest time, and you're like, well, these grapes are still white. When are they, does it color up late in the season, or what's going on? You're like digging through the leaves and the new grafts, and you're like, oh, here's some red grapes, and then you figure out, it's like, no, this is a graft that didn't take. This is still Negro Amaro, and you're like, all right, well, this is not Frappato, even I don't care what the tag said, and we still haven't figured out what it is yet.
Okay.
I'd like to think it's Grillo, but once we get into things start growing again, since everything's still dormant, we'll send it into UC Davis and see if we can figure out what it is.
Yeah.
But these lessons that you learn is like, not everything goes as planned. And there was Lowell planted some Tokai Friulano, but there's maybe he couldn't sell it, all of it back in the day. So he had like too much of it. So he grafted over some of it to Primitivo.
Okay.
And all of us are like, well, we don't really want Primitivo. We're surrounded by Zinfandel anyway, right? In the state, it's like, we don't really need Primitivo. So we're like, well, let's just ungraft it, right? We'll just, wherever the Primitivo was grafted, we'll just chop it off right there. Friulano will grow back, and we'll be fine. Well, we did it, and we've had some tough vintages. We started farming. We took over the farming in 2021, and that was right when we're like really in a drought.
Yeah,
it's like 21.
Yeah, that was kind of the worst. Or the peak of it, I guess. Right?
Yeah, and not to mention the fires that had started years before. Were continuing, and all these things that are being thrown at you. But we're like, well, let's just ungraft the Primitivo, and this will all grow back, and it'll all be fine. But we did it in the middle of a drought, and so the vines are stressed, and they're not happy. There's no water in the ground, and so instead of like 90-something%, success, we had like maybe 60.
Okay.
So it's like, all right, well, that was mistake number one. The other one, the Frappato, hopefully Grillo grafting is something that's out of our control. But these things add up, and this is part of like 4 farming your own piece of property, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you kind of, some things are in your control, some things are not, and you gotta figure out how to kind of deal with it, right, and keep things moving.
Had you had your eyes on purchasing a vineyard for a while, or was it something where it was more just kind of the right circumstances came together, or had you been out looking for something?
Yeah. I mean, it's something we wanted to do for at least 10 years, right?
Okay.
We wanted, and we definitely had a hand in some of the Solano, Green Valley spots, but not, it's still somebody else's place, right? And we're not doing the tractor work or anything like that. So it's something we've been looking at for a really long time, but there's a couple problems, right? First of all, we don't have any money. And California is very expensive, right?
Yeah.
Because when we started up, there wasn't an investment or a big line of credit with the bank. It was made 1 barrel in 2002, and then 3 barrels in 2003, and it was that kind of progression, right? And you sell it and make a little more. So we always wanted a spot, and, but you kind of have to. It was a lot of years, and I'm not going to say like a lot of bad luck, because that's not what it was. It's just like, it's a difficult thing to be able to afford land in California. That's just the way it is. It's not, and it's difficult to find people to lease to you. Some other wineries have done a good job at that, but we wanted to buy our own property. We were hoping to buy like 10 acres or something like that, 7 acres, something just to kind of, something to have like, this is our home spot, right? This is like what we've grown, and this is what we made out of it. And that idea was always appealing to me. I didn't have the idea, and I don't have the idea now, that we'd stop working with a lot of these growers that we've been working with since 2004, some of them.
Okay.
I didn't want to change that. What I wanted to do is have a home spot.
Okay.
But it's difficult financially, was probably the main reason, and kind of everything had to be lined up and fall into place. And that's kind of what happened with Fox Hill. Is I think when Sam kind of had a group of friends of us, that's what we were or are, and it's like, maybe we'll all take it over and kind of farm it collectively or stuff like that. But then Sam inherited a piece of property that his father owned out in Yorkville Highlands. And when Lowell and Barbara passed away, he's like, well, I have this property that's a lot, right? It's a lot of responsibility. And that's kind of how we ended up being the current like stewards of Fox Hill, is because of this. And like I said, we were looking for 7 acres, not 56 acres of vines, but that's what life presented, right? And we were able to kind of make it happen. And I don't think we would have done it if we didn't have Sam Bilbro, Evan Lewandowski, there's also like Rhyme and Oncaval and all this, Jupiter. And, if there wasn't this core of people, that were like committed to this property, we wouldn't be able to do it. It would be too much for us to take on, because we can only make part of that. We couldn't support the whole thing. That is we've seen, I've been working with this property for a while. So like the worst years were like 2021, 22, where we're getting, 100 tons out of 56 acres, 107 tons.
Wow. Okay.
To something like this last year, where the grounds, we had that series of storms that came in last winter. This winter's been a little bit of the same, where the ground's saturated, right? It's
Yeah.
like you get that rain in there when the vines are dormant. And now, instead of getting less than 2 tons per acre, you're getting 3.5, right? But, we wouldn't be able to do this if it didn't have like this core group, this tight group. It would have been just too much for us to handle. So.
Yeah, it seems like you have a great group of winemakers and people
Right.
in there working with you.
Yeah, and Mendocino's a little bit more affordable, than it's still California. It's still expensive, but it's a little bit more affordable than like Sonoma or Napa.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you about the love wines, just because those seem like a really great introduction to a lot of people, and I guess they're a little less expensive wine, but a little wider distribution. And you find those wines give people a good sort of introduction to the Broc style?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I mean, those kind of started as like, we wanted. It's hard to make wines affordable in California sometimes, right? And having a blend of, a lot of maybe these underappreciated old vine plantings in more obscure areas, some from like Friends Vineyards, where you can kind of do a lot of these blends to kind of come up with like, I don't know what the style is exactly, except that it's like drinkable. It's the alcohol's, moderate to low, stuff that's doesn't have a lot of things done to it, right? It's not built up outside of just blending grapes together. There's not new oak, there's not like additives or a lot of these things. It's supposed to be like a very basic, enjoyable, true expression of California wine, right? It's our California table wines.
Yeah.
And I like the idea of wines. Wine costs money. It's even $20 is a lot of money for people. But you want to have something that's on the table that you can enjoy with food and drink and not have to worry about it and stuff. And like it also gets back to the idea of like we didn't start with a lot of money, so a lot of the business model, and I'm making this sound like it's more thought out than it was, is that we make wine and people drink it and we make more wine, right? It's not supposed to like sit around or be put into somebody's cellar. It's supposed to be enjoyed and consumed, right? And that's what kind of keeps things going with a place that doesn't can't afford a lot of overhead costs, right? And that was the idea, is like get it out there, get something that people can enjoy. But it's like, I'm still surprised when a lot of people is like, before I started drinking these type of wines, whatever that means, it was Love Red or whatever was kind of like the first one. And I take a lot of pride in that if you can steer things in a different direction, right? Because part of the problem when I got it, as we were discussing, is like, when I got into wine, everything was the same, right?
Yeah.
Now everything doesn't have to be like how I do it, but there has to be differences, right? And I think California wine as a whole, it's having some problems this year, kind of like people are talking about wine sales and you know, kind
big
of
conversation this week.
yeah, it's been a big conversation, but I think overall, I think having different styles helps California, and not having everybody chasing the same thing. And I think, even now where, people are talking about some of the struggles in California wine and just, wine as a whole, I think having some of this diversity, I think helps, right? Because you have a lot to draw on, and it's not just kind of like this one mindset. And
Sure.
And I think that has helped kind of balance things out. Now, however things shake out, we'll see. We'll see what this year brings, but I'm optimistic. on kind of like the direction that California is going in right now.
Okay.
But I've been doing this for a long time, so this isn't like the first ebb and flow to things, right?
Sure. I'm sure you guys had a big dip, like probably 2008
right
or so, when you're
and
just kind of getting started. And
yeah, and or even when talking that kind of 98 to 2002 era. COVID was its own thing, so you get these peaks and valleys, and then there's a period of correction. But, all these periods are different though, right? So they're not like the same thing. Here's the exact same thing again. They're all different, and there's all these challenges, and you have to figure out how to navigate it, right? And what's the best way forward. But, but sorry, I'm getting a little off topic, but I think the love wines are, they're just supposed to be a very pure, transparent, and affordable starting point for kind of what we do here. So that was kind of the idea. And a lot of it was kind of getting back to what we were talking about in Solano County, Green Valley, was some of these old vines, like with the Love Red, just started with like multiple old vine Carignan vineyards that were just going to be left and not picked that year, or torn out and planted to cab, right? And, when we started doing that, we're kind of the only one out there amongst the vines. And then a couple of years later, you see your buddy and like, hey, what are you doing out here? Like, oh, I'm getting, that kind of thing. And then you start seeing more and more people. And that's a good thing, right? Then you start appreciating, old vine material, California history, a lot of these things. Yeah. And, that's where, kind of the Love Red got started, But the idea is just to have, get people drinking wine.
Yeah. You make a lot of different wines now. Are there one or two that are kind of especially like close to your heart, or that you, I don't know, favorite ones? Smile when you walk by the amphora or
people are like, oh, you make too much wine. I was like, well, that's what I like to do. I don't know what else, maybe get into, move back to Nebraska and get into stereo sales or something. I don't know, get an insurance job. It's like, even after all these years, it's like, it's enjoyable. It's like, oh, I can't believe I'm doing this kind of thing. But there's definitely a few wines that, and we've touched on them too. It's like the Vine Star Zen. It's like, you kind of feel like this is something that's close to your heart, and that you kind of had discovered, kind of like something unique to the winery. And I think that's probably like the first one that kind of falls into that realm. But it's like a lot of the Valdegui. It's like, we love Valdegui here. Yeah. It's like our spirit grape, it's just such a California. It's a variety that just does really well in California. It loves being kissed by the California sun, and the sugars don't get too high. The acid doesn't, fall off. It's so versatile, like rosé, reds. We do sparkling with it, and sweet wines. It's just like, it's like that grape is maybe, something that's pretty special to us. So I think those are like two good examples. Something that's kind of popped up recently is Rossetti Vineyard that we work with up in Redwood Valley. Some old, once again, 1948, 1950 plantings of like Carignan and Valdegui, but they have a very small Valdegui block. And, it's kind of bounced around between different people various years. And we made like a sparkling rosé out of it, like in 2019 or something like that. I'm getting old. I can't remember. And so we just did another vintage after a few years of, like no fruit or not enough to go around. And so we just bottled that recently too. So that's a pretty it's one you get excited about, and kind of like, oh, all right, I don't drink my own wine at home, but if I did, and, make an exception every once in a while, that's what
Yeah.
when you open up. But, we've also had a few tough years with the VineStar Zen, just, with Mother Nature and some heat spells, like 2022 wiped out a lot of our Zinfandel just because it got so hot for so long.
Right.
It's just like Zinfandel is such a thin skin variety. It just like day one, it's okay. Day two, it's okay. Day three, it's gone, kind of thing. It was just, so intense that 2023, we're hoping to have, kind of to do another bottling of VineStar after a couple tough vintages where we had some wine, but not a lot of it. Just yields were so bad, or we just couldn't work with it.
Yeah. It seems like it's kind of a foundational wine for the winery, and I love Valley when it's not messed with too much.
Right. Yeah.
With little to no oak.
Yeah.
And just
let it be what it is.
Yeah. It's really great when it's like that, I think.
But yeah, I'm still amazed that there's some of these old plantings still around. So even though they're not, some of them, it's supposed to be a high yielding grape, but once you get to a certain age, it's not yielding as much as it used to. So a lot of the Valdegui we get is like 1 ton, 2 tons per acre.
Okay, and those are like
2 tons would be great if that were the case most of the time, but it's not.
Yeah, you're getting 65, 70-year-old vines. At that point.
Yeah.
Can you tell me a little bit about some of the collaborations that you do? I notice, I know you've done like the glasses and decanters, blankets, the ice dye, and then, the one I was actually kind of most curious about was with DJ Muggs and Egon, the Notes and Tones wine. And I was just wondering how, it seems like you do a lot of the collaborations. I was wondering how some of those came about.
Most of it comes about, pretty organically. Just conversation gets started or an idea gets started. I enjoy them because for a number of years, it's just me. So that gets a little boring sometimes, So, I've always kind of liked the idea of collaborations. I like, even though it's, back in the day, it was just me in the cellar. It's not just me anymore, right? But I still like the idea of the collaboration is like, especially with like-minded people or things, like music you're interested in, and you can kind of do something to Notes and Tones, or you can kind of do something where it's like other people's palettes come into play. Is a good thing, not a bad thing, because it kind of like working with other people and kind of bouncing ideas off each other, especially when we can kind of incorporate Fox Hill into the mix. And even with the Notes and Tones, Muggs made like a really amazing record, based off of mostly or all Sun Ra samples. I think the idea of collaboration is not a business idea. It's more of, enjoying life kind of idea. It's not extra work for me. It's like wine has opened you up to like this world, right? And I think that specifically with that one, it was just like this mutual interest in wine and music that kind of got the whole thing started. And but everyone's like a little different. It could be like a wine shop that you think does something unique, right? And you work with them, or just even just a restaurant where you're like, hey, this is amazing pizza. We should, I'd love it if we could do a wine together, and and you have something you can put your label on, and I come hang out and eat pizza. It's not anything like terribly deep or anything with some of them, but then some of them, it's kind of like this bigger conversation. And exposing, like Notes and Tones. I think the idea was, maybe exposing your winery and your wines to a different audience, or a hip hop audience, and hopefully introducing some better wines or some more thoughtful wines than maybe is people are exposed to. So restaurants, kind of, exposing them to, something local as opposed to something from far away on the wine list. So, they all have their different reasons, and there's not kind of one factor on why we do it. It just has to make sense.
Yeah.
I don't know if that answers the question or not. But.
Yeah. No, totally. No, I was excited to see the Muggs one. I thought he's been one of my favorite hip hop producers for a long time.
Yeah.
And like the Now and Again records, I have a lot of those releases also. And so it's, I don't know, fun. For me, it was just a fun connection to see. I really enjoyed seeing it.
Well, yeah. I mean, it's the same experience for me as well. And, they were both up here because we just bottled our second vintage. And so, it's like there has to be like participation, right? Mm-hmm. It just can't be like, here, I did this, here's what it is, and, put a label on it and have it be something that's not true and not, maybe totally, so it's like having them up, do the blends, having them up to the vineyard, having them up to bottling, it's like a great experience, and just it's nice to have like that participation to make it. Now the record I didn't have anything to do with, but I don't know what I could contribute to that, but just from the wine sense, it's like it's pretty refreshing and pretty exciting as well.
Yeah.
I like the evolving process of things.
Okay.
So like the collaboration, especially like something like Notes and Tones, or there's a collaboration we did with a gentleman in Norway recently called Oma. Those are a lot of fun. We kind of talked a little bit about Fox Hill and not just having like your own place, finally, your old home spot, home vineyard, and working with, other winemakers that you admire and kind of keeping that core together. But, just to see how all these things last year has really got me thinking on how all these things unfold and all these connections, and you can kind of look at them, and getting back to coming from Nebraska, it's like, it's amazing what sometimes, like with kids, what's the cliche? It's like the days are long, but the years are short, kind of thing. Mm-hmm. And you kind of have, when we talk about all these things, or it's like Fox Hill and Notes and Tones, it's like you see all these kind of evolutions over the years, and you think about, that drive out from Nebraska, or, showing up at the counselor's door or whatever, to, all these things that are really just intellectually interesting, and especially things where you can put your back into it a little bit, like the physicality of the labor of the job, and just how it all connects. And last year, a lot of this really came, it came home to me when we started branching out into other things, like, so there's Fox Hill, but then there's all these olive trees. Wine is why you're there, right? That first interest and that first drive, wine is why you're there. But then all of a sudden your harvest is over and you're picking olives, and you're like, oh my God, I thought picking grapes was difficult. You should try picking these tiny olives off these giant trees, and you're having all these thoughts as you're out there, and you're like, well, man, I can't believe I'm making wine and I'm in the wine industry now, but what the hell am I doing making olive oil all of a sudden? And it's like, oh my gosh, there's 4 persimmon trees over there. And it's kind of like led into all these other things. So, it's like, oh, cool. We got an olive oil, and I still don't know what to do with like a ton of persimmons, but it's like, now all of a sudden we're like farming, we're not just a vineyard and grapes. And then all of a sudden, all these unexpected things start happening. You got all these fruit trees and all these olive trees, and it just the way this is all evolved is, some of the things you hoped it would be, and then, all these unexpected things that life presents you. So it's just kind of something I've been thinking about from the end of last harvest, or maybe it's starting to seem like harvest is never over, right? So it's been pretty fun, and the last year or so has really kind of brought that home. So, that's kind of what I would think about. That's kind of been on my mind is, you kind of reflect on it a little bit, but we'll see what next year brings and all that. So.
Yeah, harvest might never. I guess I don't know what other crops you have up there, but harvest could be a long one.
Yeah.
With everything ripening at different
stretched
times,
out.
And
as long as everything's
especially
not
this year, is probably
as long as everything's not at the same time. That's the main thing. But yeah, we'll see as we kind of try to it's great having the vineyard, but you also kind of half of it's like wooded acreage, right? And so you keep that, right?
Yeah.
Even though PG&E is going to come through and cut down part of it,
Okay.
but not to knock on PG&E here over the interview. That's not the point. It's but it's like it's not just a vineyard. Now we're kind of learning about olives and maintaining olive trees and. There's apples, figs, persimmons, pears. This property has a bunch of. You knew they were there, but you didn't think about it because it's like we're buying a vineyard.
Yeah.
And it's like, oh well, we didn't just buy a vineyard, did we? And so we're now adding to that, so it's not just like one type of crop, right?
Okay.
So you're kind of incorporating, we're going to start planting some more, mostly, maybe obscure varieties, but still like what grows well there, right?
Okay.
Obviously apples and pears and figs, and we don't need any more persimmons right now. We're good on that,
Good
but
on those.
But expanding on that a little bit, I think, and taking some more branches off those olive trees and putting those in the ground and expanding the olives is, hopefully we can figure out a way to kind of pick those a little easier. This year, a lot of it's just learning about growing, as far as growing grapes and fruit trees and olive trees. And we've kind of made the step from maybe what was conventionally farmed before we got there to transitioning to organics to being fully certified organic, and then kind of learning about what the next steps are from there. So we stopped tilling this year, and kind of crimping. We've had sheep and pigs out kind of like around the property and kind of what that entails, but also just building up the health of the vineyards, something that's, kind of been taking up a lot of time.
Okay.
Research.
Yeah, of course.
Because there's a lot going on right now. So it's like we're kind of learning, crimping's one of them. But, we've learned that, ground squirrels like, lot of grass cover, so it's like, all right, well, how do we handle this? So we put up owl boxes and, and then it's like, how do you, get some nutrients into the ground? A lot of things with the drought the last few years is like, like a lot of the trees died, right, during that drought. But now we have all this like wood chip material, so we kind of chipped a lot of it, and we started composting our first compost this year, and it's amazing. It looked like a lot, but when you were talking the amount of acreage and 100 tons of like, grapes that made like, it's a lot of pumice, but it's also a very small amount of pumice, once you get up there, so the compost pile is like, oh, well, wait a minute. We have all these wood chips. So, now we're incorporating the wood chips into our compost pile, and we just did that the other day.
Okay.
And then, we're just built like a biochar kiln, so we're gonna,
nice.
so some of the bigger branches and stuff that we couldn't, what a lot of people do in a lot of areas, it's like they just get a burn pile and they set it on fire, and this is the time of year, and it's like, well, what can we do differently than that? So, we'll experiment next week, is kind of like one of the next steps is like get this biochar kiln going, and you burn it, but that smoke is kind of like consumed by the way this kiln's set up, and then put that through the chipper and get that into our
Okay.
and after a while we're going to have a pretty, if everything goes good, a pretty nice, now much larger compost pile.
Yeah.
And so I think having like this vineyard has allowed us to really kind of like experiment and do things that we wouldn't, otherwise be able to do.
Yeah.
And participate more. So, and I'm sure there's going to be like some more mistakes coming,
Sure.
down the road, but
course.
it's a pretty, it's a, this is a dormant time of year, but there's a lot going on,
Yeah.
and so this is where we get to kind of get outside our norm and experiment a little bit more and learn a little bit more. And so yeah, that's kind of what's on our mind right now, is kind of like what are the next steps to kind of improve upon what's already been started.
Yeah. That's great. Yeah. It's a year-round process now
Yeah,
with your own vineyard,
Right.
and your own farm, I guess, really.
Yeah.
Your own ranch.
yeah. So this has been kind of a fun next step, and we'll see where it goes.
Nice. What's the best way for people to get your wines? And you guys have some wine clubs and lots of events here also.
It's funny, when we first started having events, it's usually me and a few friends and, hanging out. Now it's like families and dogs and kids and all that stuff. The events are a good way to, if you ever want to visit the winery, is like, there's always, seems like something is going on. The website's the easiest. Broccellars.com is the easiest way to get wine, but we're also lucky. I think we're in like 45 different states. So there's, and however, 8 different countries, I can't even remember. So, it kind of gets back to the idea of the love wines. We like having, it might not be a lot to a certain state, but we like having the wines out there and having people being able to, try them. So, but the website's the easiest thing to order wine or, olive oil or
Yeah.
persimmon butter or a t-shirt, right? So, but the wine club is also, there's a lot of small quantity things, especially when we're talking about some old vine sites. So the wine club is maybe a good way to get a few things that aren't easily accessible too. So, that's always a fun way to maybe get something unexpected.
Thanks for listening today to my conversation with Chris. Broc is making a real delicious and diverse array of natural wines. The Fox Hill wines are especially interesting, and the love wines you can find in larger distribution than most other natural wines, in bottles and in cans. The tasting room is a great place to hang out if you're in the area, and grab some of the smaller releases also. You can follow them on Instagram at Broc Cellars and find all their wines on the website at broccellars.com. Like Chris mentioned, they also have a lot of events at the winery. You can follow the podcast on wherever you're listening, and the Instagram at Indie Wine Podcast, and feel free to email indiewinepodcast@gmail.com with comments, questions, or feedback. If you could tell your wine friends about the podcast too, even just one of them, and help spread the word, I'd really appreciate it. Rating or subscribing helps too. There's also a Patreon if you choose to support the podcast monetarily to allow for more episodes and to help defray other costs. Any amount is appreciated. The link is in the show notes. We now have a small token of our appreciation to send to you also. We'll be back soon with another episode. Have a good one.